Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the joint webinar of Proteus Cyber and Trezorit, entitled 5 Key Steps for SMBs to GDPR Compliance. This session summarizes the key implications of GDPR regarding data management, and I'm pleased to welcome our two hosts, John Cleland, Managing Director and Founding Partner at Proteus Cyber, and István Lám, Co-Founder and CEO at Trezorit. We will collect questions during the webinar. For our participants, I'm saying that in the top left corner of your Zoom interface, you will see a Q&A button, and please post your questions here, and our hosts will get to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. And John and István, the floor is yours now.
Okay, István, I'll let you do the introduction.
So, welcome everybody. What I would like to talk about today, if we can switch to the slide 3, or first about myself. I'm a cryptography engineer and co-founder of Trezorit. My background is nothing to do with that people. I design cryptographic protocols, and that was why, with some of my colleagues, we set up Trezorit. And John is here because I think they're experts in how to make compliance work, how to create a process out of compliance. Maybe John, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, so we are Proteus Cyber, and I'm John Cleland, the Managing Director of Proteus Cyber, and we have developed a number of products specifically to do with GDPR. We have a basic product, we have an SME product, and we have our enterprise product, and we're experts in GDPR. We've been doing GDPR for quite some time. And we have a number of clients using our software. And I'm here today really with Trezorit to talk about the areas of GDPR that a small company can address. And really today is all about what is appropriate for a small company rather than some of the larger ones. Okay.
Thank you, John. So maybe let me start with the first slide, what you can see. What is the GDPR? This is a unified law across Europe, and I think this is as itself one of the first steps in the EU to unify some of the regulations. What has been done through directives, which is a rule for the member states how they should implement, but this is as itself applies to all member states and applies as it is. So the member state doesn't need to create a new law and implement on a different way. There is one language, one rule, and this is what you need to follow. And you will need to follow from 25th of May in 2018. That's 2 years after it has been voted and accepted in Brussels. There are many obligations. It puts on data processors and data controllers, and that meeting with its requirements can be quite resource heavy. And there are a lot of questions how you can simplify that, how you can make it easier. And one important thing is prioritization. How putting and focusing on the areas what you think is the most important. What I would like to do is a quick poll among you. So what do you think, what is the biggest challenge regarding GDPR at the moment? If you can share the poll, or shall I share the poll? Okay. Launch poll. Okay. So what is the biggest challenge regarding GDPR at the moment? The first can be managing vendors and processors. So please select what you think is the most important. The second is meet organizational requirements, for instance, avoiding DPO, set up policies like data breach notification processes, protecting data from exposure in a GDPR compliant manner, increase staff awareness on data protection, and managing user consent, as GDPR puts user consent, clear consent is required for data processing. And I'm looking at if we have the votes, or should we continue. I leave the poll open and continue with the presentation. Please feel free to select your answers. So, what is the question is, what are your most risky areas? So that it is not necessarily coming from the law that certain areas should be the most, or should be considered as the most risky area. You need to find and identify those parts, and that's up to you. And what you have as principles, as somebody who's working in privacy for a long time, and also very privacy conscious, and I think it is important to do this and enforce it. I think it is great that GDPR defines this principle. First thing is fairness. The second can be the transparency and lawfulness of processing the data. Also, it is important to highlight that you need to communicate and the purpose of limitations and the data processing, but also you need to use the purpose later on. So you cannot overdo it. You cannot go beyond the original purpose. So you cannot process the data or sell the data if you didn't get consent to that. There is also an important part of data minimization. There's quality questions as well, so someone can ask for correcting, and obviously security, integrity, and confidentiality. And I would like now to close the poll, and I don't know if that could be, how can I share the results? Can you see the results? Good. So basically, what you can see now, that the voting, significant vote went on meeting organizational requirements, appointing a DPO, set up policies like data breach notification processes. So let's get back to the slides. Can you see the slides? And maybe the next one, that what are the steps of and what we think could be the steps for GDPR compliance as an overview. Obviously, there might be other ways to do that, but this is a guidance what we think might be useful for SMEs and SMBs. First one is to create a data register and a map, basically, of personal data. The second step is the checking the third parties and processing vendors. You know, where the data goes. Is it an email server? Or is it outsourced to someone? The third step should be technical safeguards, applying safeguards of the GDPR, meaning from encryption to proper two-factor authentication and so on. That's technical safeguards all together. The fourth is creating policies for IT reconciliation. That's how you manage internally these questions. And also analyze the risk data breach risks in your organization at the end, and how that what you did before, how that's helped to prevent data breaches. But you can always just minimize the risks. You cannot prevent it. It is important to note, and you need to be aware what are the risks in this regard. So I would like to hand over to John.
Thank you, Sven. Yeah, so as Sven said, appointing a DPO, for larger companies over 250, it's mandatory to have a data protection officer. But for smaller companies, that is not necessary. And what we have is 3 versions of our tool. Okay, we have a basic, which is what I'm going to talk about today, which is really designed for small companies. And it's about a balance. Our enterprise product is currently used by 2 Fortune 100 companies, and they have very large requirements. But for smaller companies, although the legislation still applies to you, there is a proportionality as to what you should do. But one thing you definitely need to do, of course, is create a data register and map your personal data against your processes. So can I have the next slide? You move to the next slide? Yeah, okay. So Article 30. I've just highlighted the areas on Article 30 here and picked out some of the bits. So you need to have your controllers. So do you have joint controllers? Who is the controller of the data? And who are the processors and sub-processors? So if you have anybody processing data on your behalf, of course, you need to keep the contact details of those. So you might have joint controllers. You may be a joint controller for the data. You may have sub-processors. Purpose of processing. Who is going to have access to the data? Which data subject categories? Who are the recipients of that data? Do you transfer data outside of the EU? Of course, that's a key part. Is it EU or US privacy shield rules? Do you need to apply those? Or are there any corporate binding rules for international transfers? Retention period, how long do you keep the data for? Do you lose a client? So if somebody stops being a customer for any reason, what are the time limits? When do you erase the data? And what security measures? So part of the data register is making sure that you can do identify your processes that use personal data, be able to map how that personal data maps onto processes. So what personal data do you need to deliver a particular service? And Sven was talking about data minimization. We've seen quite a lot of occasions where the business, the delivery of the service requires perhaps 10 pieces of data, but when we look at our IT, when we do the reconciliation into IT, we find we're collecting 20. And so the reason for and purposes of processing that data is very important. And then you can make sure that you're not collecting data that you don't need in order to deliver the service. So if I could have the next slide. So we would divide this Article 30 into, so if you just play that one through, that would be great. So we start off with the business owners. We split the Article 30 into 2 parts inside our tool. We contact business owners first, and we issue a data process mapping survey. It is the business owners that understand what they need in order to deliver a service. So, for example, if you have an online service delivering car insurance, you understand that I need to know where you live, I need to know how many times you've crashed your car, how many speeding tickets you have. Those are the things I need in order to deliver the service. And when we talk about consent rules, if I am collecting data for which you've asked me to deliver a service and I need that data in order to deliver it, I don't necessarily need the consent rules. It's all part of delivery of that service. However, if I was to take your data and share it with another third-party company, I do need consent rules. So consent rules come into this as well. But it's the business owners that understand what data they need to deliver a service. And we then take that process data mapping, and we then we look at how we handle that inside our IT. So we have an IT data handling survey which says, how do we store the data? Where do we store it? Do we store it on a virtual server outside of the EU? Does it transit any international boundaries? Who do we disclose that data to? Who has access to that data? Are there any third-party processors that use it? And those two things together then form your data register and your Article 30 report. Okay, so if we just go on to the next one. So yeah, when it comes to third parties, we're looking at which processes do we disclose data to third parties? How do those third parties manage your data? Of course, you can't absolve yourself from the responsibility of the data. If you hand your data to a third party and they maybe you outsource your billing, and you're still responsible for that data. So when you're looking at third-party vendors, you need to make sure where do they store the data, and are they storing it on an AWS server, perhaps outside of the EU? And what security measures do they apply to your data? So Proteus, we have a GDPR Ready Basic, which is what I'm talking about today. And really, this is a very simple tool. It's one site, one survey, one summary report. And it's really designed for small companies to get them on the road to GDPR compliance. And it allows you to model your processes against your personal sensitive data. You can establish how you go about handling that data. And it will create a simple report for you which contains recommendations, maybe a project plan for the things that you've identified, the anomalies. And it provides you with a set of templates for the policies that you don't have. And we'll come to a slide on that a little bit later. So should I share my screen, Esteban? Do a quick intro. See.
Yes, Esther will is sharing or giving you to share your.
You should see the browser window now. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, great. Well, look, I'm going to show you just very quickly, just a couple of minutes. I'm showing you the type of the GDPR basic tool. It starts off with a series of surveys you see down here, down the left-hand side, and we have some instructions on how to fill that survey out. And we start off with, who is your data controller? Who are your controllers and processors? And what policies do you have in place? So acceptable use policy, etc. And where you don't have these things, where you've identified areas that are missing, Proteus will provide you with those templates for you to use. We have a very simple set of questions around things that you ought to be considering and what's your current status. Then we have the process data mapping of the tool. So here you put in your business processes, and you can see that each process is here. And how do you go about processing the data with help text? So do you do systematic profiling? Do you do automatic profiling? All the things related to GDPR. You can capture flag risks or create tasks where you identify deficiencies. You can look at what personal identifiable data you use. And for each process that you define, you then have an IT survey. Now you can see there's 4 IT surveys here because I have 4 processes. And on the IT survey, we're talking, is it encrypted? Do we use Trezorit's fantastic encryption? And then once we've finished answering all those questions, we end up with a report that summarizes what we have. So we have, so many processes, so many data items in the data register. We have a number of tasks that we've identified. We have a number of recommendations, etc. So there's our PIAs and how we go about processing that data. Here's our data register containing a number of items. We have the controllers and processors. We have some required documents, and we can download those templates for the ones that we don't have. We have a project plan and recommendations. So there's a brief view for you of GDPR basics. So it really is designed for a small company, just to go through, process the data mapping. I won't go through all of the questions, but you can see that. So how do I swap that hand back to you, Esteban? There you go.
Just a second.
So if we go back to the slides. Yeah, so what you end up with is a summary report. And this is just a simple timeline. I mean, for small companies, really, you should be looking to, with a tool like GDPR Basic, you can establish a good level of understanding of what processes you have, how it relates to the data, what security measures you've applied to them, who are you sharing that data with, are there any international transfers, etc., etc. And you should be able to build a report for your auditors and at least show that you have a plan towards GDPR compliance. So if we move on to the next slide. Yes, so over to you, Sven.
Yes, so what I think it's important to highlight about technical measures. There are several technical measures, and I think it is important to note that it is part of the process to do the technical measures. But what I like in John's products, that they actually were able to simplify or create the guideline from the law itself, and providing a tool during this journey, during this roads, where you can feel and where you need to put the technical measures. But it comes to the technical measures at some point. You need to implement those. And one very important technical measure is encryption. It is close to my heart because, as I mentioned, this is what I'm doing, and this is what we are doing at Trezorit. And I would like to talk about that specific thing, but I want to highlight to you that encryption is not necessarily the only technical measure what you can do inside your company. There are many other ways, from just physically locking physical paper documents to two-factor authentication and so on. So about encryption, GDPR says in Article 32 that explicitly that the pseudonymization and encryption of personal data is a good way of protecting electronic data. And what is pseudonymization? It is a way of processing personal data, so it cannot be used to identify a specific individual without using additional information. This is bluer. This is bluer where it stands. But for instance, whether having just using the last 4 digits of a credit card is the right way. It is industry standard that can be a right way to identify that specific person. Was it good to do similar way, for instance, in a phone number? There might be things like that, where you can still use parts of the data, but you hide the rest of that. That can be the pseudonymization. Or in case of, for instance, a healthcare institution, you cover the name, but having the X-ray pictures there, but there is no name attached to the X-ray image. Encryption is, you can view that as a much more sophisticated way of pseudonymization. It is a way to hide the information from the one who cannot access the key, the encryption key. And it's there are a lot of ways to encrypt. I want to talk about that as well. For instance, if you use encryption on different scenarios, there might be different ways to look at that. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So the first, what is usually used as server-side encryption and channel encryption combined. What it means that you, when you connect to cloud storage, for instance, you upload through SSL or TLS connection the data. That protects during the transfer, because no one at the Wi-Fi living in your Wi-Fi network can see the data, but the data is decrypted, as you can see in this slide. The data is decrypted on the server side. So from the cloud perspective, it is PII or personal data, because it can be used to identify one specific person, even though it is encrypted on the way up to the cloud. From the cloud provider perspective, it is decrypted. The cloud provider has access to the personal information, so you need to look into their ways of processing that information. There might be a second encryption. It's called at-rest encryption or disk encryption. That is done by the cloud provider, and that is not viewed as a way to hide from the cloud provider. It's an additional measure, that's true, but it's not sufficient enough. NIST has a statement about that encryption can be viewed as a proper measure only if encryption happens, and the key is encryption happens on the controller side, so on your side, not on the cloud side, and the keys are managed on your side and not the cloud side. In case of at-rest encryption, this is not what is going through. In case of at-rest encryption, the keys are managed and the process is managed by the cloud provider. And there is the second step, when the data is shared with someone else inside your organization or outside of our organization. In case of Bob in this slide, then the data might be re-encrypted, put it in a channel, and Bob receives it in this channel, but it doesn't change anything. There's another way of encryption, and this is what ENISA, an EU agency, preferring as well, saying that the encryption process and the key management should be on the end user or the end user side, or the business or the controller side. And this is the end-to-end encryption, where the data is encrypted on the customer side, not on the cloud side. So you encrypt the data under your control. You have the access to the key, not the cloud provider. The cloud provider just store and provide a service of storing that data in an encrypted form. Encrypted form means the cloud provider cannot use that data for identification. So from this perspective, the data is not personal data. And end-to-end encryption has challenges, mostly coming from collaboration, because it is easy to imagine how you, for instance, encrypt something, upload it to the cloud, and having the key on your machine, and when you retrieve that data, you decrypt with the same key. But the complexity comes when you share with someone else, and how do you transfer the key on a way that other party, in this case Bob, receives the key, but the cloud provider does not. And in general, what are the advantages of encryption? First, it protects the personal data of employees, customers, partners, users. Whenever you are storing data, it should be encrypted in every place. And with end-to-end encryption, what you can achieve, that you can keep the personal data inside your company. So you don't need to monitor a third party. You don't need to look into the processes, because you're not handing over personal information. That makes you're reducing your liability in case of a data breach, because that data, what you send out, and the provider might have a data breach, but you don't need to care about that, because GDPR specifically says if any data leaks out, you don't need to. It's not viewed as a breach of personal data or leakage of personal data. It might be a breach itself, but you don't have the obligation, for instance, creating a public notification and notifying the authorities and so on. So your liability is significantly reduced. And that saves you costs, because in case of a breach notification, which is a process you need to do with the authorities, and you have very short time to do so, you don't need to go through that, and you are not facing to fines. And it's also easier to manage compatibility of the consent you get from users. I mean, if the user tell you that you cannot use it for automatic processing, and you upload it to Google, who's doing automatic processing for you, well, that is something you need to look into your privacy policy. Maybe you need to change if you're using such services. And in case of end-to-end encryption, you don't need to do that. And obviously, if you have all of that, you can always, if you want to reach that, you can use your own server. You can use your own infrastructure. Because in that case, you're not outsourcing to someone, but then you cannot use the advantages of a public cloud, which is a managed infrastructure, easy deployments, better costs, and so on. And there are many providers out there. Trezorit is one provider. We are operating since 2011, and we are offering solution for end-to-end for files. So whenever you would like to store files end-to-end encrypted and collaborate on that with external parties or within your company, Trezorit is a great tool for that. And we also created governance tools, how you can, for instance, set up policies for your employees to control their behavior, to minimize the risk of a rogue employee step. But there are other providers. For instance, for email, there is a ProtonMail or Tutanota, who are doing an increased level of secrecy. I'm using increased level of secrecy because they have a compatibility layer with a non-end-to-end encrypted provider. So if you're using ProtonMail with a Gmail, so sending to a Gmail user, it is not end-to-end encrypted, but it's not because ProtonMail cannot manage that. And there are messaging like Wire or Trima. These are good services you may want to look at. And I would like to hand it back over to you, John.
Thank you, Kirsten. So if you just move to the next slide for me. Look, for small companies, there's a lot to GDPR. as Esfan was saying, using the trezor encryption, of course, is going to, encrypting your data, is going to help you significantly. But that's just one part of it. There's a lot to GDPR, and some of these things are not always appropriate to small companies, and it's quite difficult to know where to start. So the thing about something that's GDPR ready is that it does give you a worked through process of identifying the data against your processes, and then having somewhere to record how you go about handling that data, whether it's encryption or pseudonymization or storage or disclosure. Some of these policies you won't need, and I think there is a when we're talking to the authorities, the view is very much the companies that are likely to attract the worst fines are the ones that have done nothing. But if you have a good understanding of what processes you have that use personal data, where they are, what data they use, how it's handled, and you have a policy and procedure for each of these areas, this is what you should work towards. And these templates, if you like, if you don't have these policies, these are the ones you should sort of aspire to put in place. Now, not all of them are applicable, okay? And if they're not applicable, then obviously don't do them. But these are the ones that you really should be looking at, seeing whether you have these things in place. And if you don't, use the templates and have a stab at it. So, yes, I think that's it. If you move to the next one, this time.
Yes, thank you. So what I would like to talk at the fifth step is looking at your breach risks inside your organization after you did all of these. This might be done in a circle all around, but first how you will do it until May. Next one. Here's a common causes of data breaches, and which might be important to highlight that most of the breaches are rooted in a malicious or criminal attack, but still there's a significant amount is coming from human error or a system glitch, and that you need to manage those as well. If we can go to the next slide, you need to manage those. What do we mean by malicious attack? That someone that go and break your cloud provider and leak the information. And then the question is, when you analyze the risks, that do you use technical safeguards such as encryption to prevent such a malicious attack? Do you have antivirus, and do you have patches to endpoint secrecy, or do you have a team who's working with that, or do you have enough resources in the IT to do that? And there are other, the human error. What you need to analyze is that how do you share personal data internally or externally? Is it just ad hoc? Is there any consideration to any authorization or authentication of the other user, not sharing with non-rightful users? Would a phishing attack work on you and on your people? And if something goes wrong, how you can invoke the access? How do you deal with changes in sharing? But it also comes to the question: did you communicate requirements to your employees? Do you have policies in place which you can refer when someone doing something bad? Is it defined what is bad and what is good? How you share information, because it might not be clear for your employees? And did you train them to prevent? Do you have awareness trainings in your organization? And obviously, things can go wrong always, and with system glitches. But what are the chances? How do you manage if something goes wrong with a cloud provider, a third-party provider, or during your process? And these are the riskiest what you may want to ask from yourself and from your organization. Um, just to sum up what we discuss today, first, that with GDPR, you really need to have a holistic view and look through how the data is protected within your organization. And because of this holistic view, you need to prioritize. You need to start with the most risky areas. You need to focus on things and simplify things. And that, for instance, there are tools like or processes to do that. We presented you how you can go through the GDPR compliance. One important was map your personal data and how that flows inside your organization and how that interacts with these processes. I think that is a very good tool. What John presented today with the GDPR Ready, I think that's that can be a great guide for that. And don't forget about applying safeguards, especially, I mean, especially if it's simple to turn on, because then you minimize risks and you don't need to deal with something which is might be out of scope if you use encryption. Think about it, because you might have other areas where you want to focus, for instance, trainings and educating your colleagues, instead of looking at the risks of a cloud provider and how they operate, what their policy says, how is it compatible with us. If you use encryption, usually that simplifies the whole process. So now I would like to jump into a Q&A session. Maybe you can jump to the next slide. There are a few, you can find more information at www.proteuscyber.com or treasury.com/GDPR if you need any more information. Now, what is, I have a question. Does the GDPR differentiate between different methods of encryption? One important thing is the architecture of encryption and the algorithm of encryption. GDPR not specifically mentioning an algorithm for encryption, saying that industry standard, and currently the industry standard is AES as the algorithm. There are other known and accepted encryption algorithms as well for symmetric key encryption, but they're for asymmetric or public-private key encryption. But the GDPR does not say this is what you need to follow. There are standardization bodies who are updating and keep updating those. You need to always follow in GDPR saying that industry accepted algorithms. With the architecture, which is a different part of the question, it does differentiate the encryption. So that what I try to explain, that end-to-end encryption that you as the most probably controller in the process, you as a controller or processor, you are managing the keys and the encryption process, not someone else on behalf of you. And that is differentiated, because then if you managing the encryption process and only you have access to the key, then what you hand out, for instance, in case of pen-to-pen encryption, what you upload to the cloud, it is not private information anymore. So GDPR does not apply to that data storage. Or if you apply encryption in a way that you outsource that encryption process, then the third party, you need to look into the third party, how they do encryption, and work with that. Is there any other question related? I think I have a question. Could you provide the slides shown after the webinar to the participants? I think we can send it if we have the emails. I think that's possible, and we may put it on a blog or blog on the website. So both things, and we use systems which uses such systems that enables downloads of documents which may contain personal data to employee laptops, PC. Shall we throw out all of these systems and use an environment that shows documents on the web only? Just to repeat or understand, if I understand the question correctly, that basically downloading to the local computer, is it a problem to downloading on to your laptop, or should you use your browser instead of that? What do you think, John? Is it the right way to understand this question?
So, can you just repeat that?
We use systems which uses such systems that enables downloads of documents which may contain personal data to employee laptops, PCs, basically downloading files, just simplifying, to laptops which contain personal data. Shall we throw out all of these systems and use an environment that shows documents on the web only?
Well, look, it's about applying the appropriate security measures. Okay, so what you have to think about, I mean, the scenario that you've pointed out there is quite a common one. But when the data is on your laptop, of course, that's another place where it potentially can be breached. So it's about minimizing that process. So, how do you secure your laptops? If one gets stolen, what do you do with it? Is your laptop encrypted? So obviously, the less places you have the data, the better. So, I mean, if you think you can get a better architecture by using a web-only client, then maybe that's what you should use.
Maybe I just to refer to that, encrypting your laptop, for instance, turning on BitLocker, and on Mac you have the also encryption, or even that is turned on in the recent Macs by default. That is essential if you do that. It is important to highlight that web only doesn't mean the information is not on the hard drive of the laptop of that employee. So if you view a PDF in the browser only, that PDF is downloaded in the cache of the browser, and that's on the disk. So someone steals a laptop and look at the browser cache, and there you go. So here you might able to minimize that, but you cannot prevent appropriate measures with endpoint secrecy. And for instance, what do you do if the laptop is there is no passwords protection on the laptop, and the attacker just opens up and the document is in the browser?
I mean, part of what we're talking about here, and definitely GDPR, is really about stimulating thought. I mean, the fact is, you've just identified something there and said, well, look, this is downloaded to a local laptop. What do I do about it? If you were unfortunate enough to be breached, how you'll be viewed in this area will be about what you thought about, how you recorded, you identified a problem, possibly, and what security measures, what did you do in order to cover yourself in that area? I think that's the most important thing, when how you'll be viewed and whether you potentially, on what level of fines you might get if you are breached, will be on how you can demonstrate what you did to identify those issues and then deal with them.
It is important, since there was an example earlier this year. That was a HIPAA breach, which John, you are doing. Do you do in HIPAA as well, compliance?
We do, yeah.
And there was a HIPAA breach in the U.S. That's a healthcare regulation, and a laptop was stolen or lost, who knows? And there was a possibility that laptop has 700 patient records on it. They couldn't demonstrate it was not on the laptop, but most importantly, they couldn't demonstrate the laptop was encrypted. And then they got a $3.5 million fine because they couldn't demonstrate the laptop was encrypted. And did what John mentioned, that did you do the appropriate measures? So did you turn on encryption? And how do you demonstrate? That's another question. But that's, I think, documentation. So if you have inside your company, you have a documentation saying that, look, I went through, and here's the log. Here's that we turned on encryption on every device, especially on the mobile devices. Then you are good, so that you can demonstrate that I did appropriate measures. I have a policy. I identified the problem and turned on BitLocker. Yes, the laptop is gone, but here's what I'm doing. This is the process and how I operate. So then you can say, okay, that was an appropriate measure, and then you might not face a fine. Most probably, you will not face a fine.
Let's face it, the industry is not doing a particularly great job. I mean, there were 143 million data breaches last year. Unfortunately, they're a fact of life, and all areas of business have been affected in some way by data breaches. I mean, they happen. They're not going to stop after the 25th of May. But being able to demonstrate your compliance, say what you did in order to apply these security measures. I mean, we've had CEOs that have suffered data breaches and said, well, we have no clue where our data is, whether it was encrypted or not, how much we've lost, and who's been affected. And there's been some very high-profile cases in that area. And I think what GDPR is an opportunity to actually sort of, grab it with both hands and to review all of your processes, understand how they relate to data and what security measures you put in place. But it's when a breach occurs, it's about the demonstration of what you did. You may have still been breached, but you did your best, and you identified all the areas, and you can prove that. And that will undoubtedly put you in a much better light with your authorities.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. It's whoa, I did something. No. Okay. I clicked on. Maybe you cannot see the question now, but if I understood it correctly, I should also track my business partners if they store data correctly. Otherwise, I will get punished.
Correct. That's correct. You can't absolve yourself from the data if you're outsourcing it. I mean, basically, they are processing the data on your behalf, and you have to make sure that they're also compliant to GDPR. So that's correct.
What I would like to also highlight that when it comes down to business partners, you need to have a documentation in place, so that if the partner, for instance, in Trezorit, we put it in the terms of use that we do end-to-end encryption, and we cannot access to the data, and so on and so on and so on. If you have, what are the measures, what you can enforce to that other party, what they are doing with your data, what you outsource to them. If they breach that document, that's a different question. What do you think about that? So it's, for instance, someone writes explicitly in the data processing agreement that they are doing this and this measure, they didn't do, and there was a breach at the partner side. Would you be punished? What do you think, John?
The answer to that is probably yes. I mean, it's your choice to outsource. If you decide to outsource your billing, that's your choice, and you're giving your data to somebody else to process on your behalf. It is your duty to make sure that they are compliant to GDPR. So this is what we're all about, auditing your third-party suppliers. And I don't think relying on a contract between you and them is going to be particularly impressive to the regulators.
Well, but if at least you have that, because in several cases you don't even have that, such a documents, data processing agreements, just a easy privacy policy, which is doesn't really tell you anything about the protective measures. So I'm not a lawyer, but my reading in GDPR that you have absolutes, you have liability, but your liability is smaller because you can present that you did something. At least there is a binding documentation there. You still might face with fines, but significantly smaller if in the other case that you didn't even include those measures in the agreement, and they didn't do so. That but they also, I think that it's important, the GDPR puts liability on the partner itself, so the partner will be liable itself, even though they didn't include that particular measure. For instance, they didn't include that they will encrypt, and they didn't, and there was a breach. They are liable for that as well, but you are liable as well. Before that, you were the only liable, but they were not, because they said we don't do encryption, and that's it.
Yes, I mean, ultimately, I think the liability will reside with the controller of the data. Who is responsible for the data? If you choose to have a sub-processor of that data, I think the majority of the liability sits with the controller of that data. And if you use a sub-processor, then that's fine. And of course, you can have a bun fight over who's responsible for the breach and afterwards. But you can see that some companies would look to avoid their liability by saying, well, look, we outsource everything and we've got a contract with them, therefore we're okay. It's their fault. But ultimately, the liability is the controller of the data, not the process.
Maybe for someone who is new to GDPR, can you summarize, because we didn't discuss the controller, processor, and the sub-processor. What are those, the roles, really briefly, because that might put some light on this question as well.
Okay, so if I'm the controller of the data, and let's say I outsource my billing, they would be a sub-processor of my data. So it's my data, my customers. I outsource the billing. They are sub-processors of my data. I may receive some data back from them where they become the controllers of the data. They are responsible for it. And we have a number of companies where they have joint controllers, and they have many sub-processors. It's a complicated thing, but you need to understand who is responsible and the controller of the data, and who is the sub-processors of your data.
Maybe my view on that, just again simplifying that controller, when you having direct connection and ability towards a private person, and processor when you are doing on behalf of a company, not of a private person. So that might be the most important thing. When you receive a private information from a company, you're most probably a processor. If you receive it from a private person, you're most probably a controller. Am I right?
Yes, broadly.
Another question. We have. Just click on that. We have majority of data on Google Drive. How should the process of implementing GDPR should like then? Are there any differences? Well, my view on that first starts with removing and putting it in a properly encrypted cloud provider, for instance, Trezor. But maybe John, you might be able to give a less biased answer in this regards.
No, I think the Trezor thing is a good idea. Well, I mean, where is that data stored? Where is it stored? I mean, if you look at Amazon,
it's Google Drive. Google Drive.
Yes, but I mean, it's got to be stored somewhere, right? If it's stored in the United States, of course, you've got the EU-US privacy, because your data is effectively being shared outside of the EU. So you have to have some sort of corporate binding rules, or maybe the EU-US privacy shield would come into force. So, I mean, if you look at Amazon Web Services, for example, you can have, regional. You can use their regional jurisdictions such that you can make sure that no data ever leaves the EU. So, for example, Amazon Web Services offer a regional thing where your data is stored in Germany, and they will guarantee that your data will not be backed up or leave the European Union. Now, with regards to Google, I'm not sure what the status of that is. But if your data is leaving the EU, then there is additional legislation that applies to you.
My another view is first, what you need to do is really look into in the vendor. When you look at your vendors on Google Drive, in that as a supplier or vendor, what is the privacy policy in terms of use, and what is the data processing agreements, if any, is in place with Google. And if, for instance, just looking at Google terms of Google Drive terms of use, it says when you upload, submit, store, send, or receive content or through or service, you give Google a verbal license to use, host, store, reproduce, modify, create derivative works, communicate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute such content. Is it in line with your privacy policy, what you present to your customers? If so, most probably not. But if so, then you may be fine. But then you need to modify your privacy policy, communicate it to your customer. If you're a controller, if you're a processor, you cannot do that. You don't really have a luxury to do that because you are not contracting with a private person. If you're a processor, you need to lay down it's in your data processing agreements, communicating to the controller who's handed to the company you're receiving the private information from, and they must provide a consent that you store it on Google with these terms and services. That's why I told consent compatibility might cause a lot of headaches, because communicating and going back to the root might be a problem. And when you present to your customer, or even though it's a private customer or a business customer, that, oh, to give a consent to that to me doing this, it might not be cool. So that's why using putting the level higher with your suppliers, um, using zero knowledge way or end-to-end encryption with your data storage, put the level higher, and then you don't need to go back or worry about going back to your customers and business partners. I think. Is there anything you would like to add, John, at this stage, or?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Then I would like to ask you if you have any further question, then send it to us, and we try to answer, and hopefully we'll able to help you. We need to highlight that we are not lawyers, so that there are several cases where we cannot provide you answer, but there are things where we can maybe point towards the solution. I would like to thank John to participate in this events. I think it was great. You could present a solution and also show and share your expertise with us. And I would like to thank all of you to join us today. Hopefully it was helpful. If you have any feedback to us, please don't hesitate to reach us on any of the forms of communication forms we already provided to you, to Esther, or to someone else you spoke with before the webinar. So thank you, and have a nice afternoon. Goodbye.
Cheerio.